That's okay.
So, shall we start? And for that, I will mute you all, or you're all muted anyway, so that's okay. So let's take a moment to settle into our seats. Close your eyes. And arrive. And by arriving, we mean more specifically to come into the body, to come into the breath. And as you tune into the sensations of the body and the breath, that's an invitation to become present. Take a moment to tune into the intention that pulls you to listen, to gather, to practice. And holding that intention, with your next exhalation, join your hands together at your heart. Use the touch of the thumbs against the body to bring your attention into the center of the heart, the seat of truth, of wisdom, of compassion, and the space that we want to listen from and speak from and practice toward through our time together tonight. And holding your attention there, we'll Om once to initiate the practice. Take a full breath in. Bow your head over for a moment, and then release the hands. Lift your head. Gently open your eyes. So tonight is Act 3 of Shiva's wild and ecstatic dance. The cycles are so far creation, maintenance, and what comes after those two is destruction. It's like birth, life, and death, the ultimate circle of life. And so this third act is called in Sanskrit samhara, and it's defined using these 4 words: destruction, dissolution, reabsorption, and retraction. And each one of those words and the slightly different flavor that they bring informs us on this part of the dance. This particular act is symbolized by Shiva's upper left hand, in which he is holding a small flame. And this represents fire, the fire that ultimately destroys, rains down destruction, and that, when it runs unchecked, decimates what it encounters. Interestingly enough, in national parks in the US and Canada, for a period of time, rangers maintaining the parks were super successful at limiting the forest fires. They were really great at minimizing damage by lightning and any damage, any forest fires initiated by humans visiting the parks. And what they found very shortly is that the fire was necessary to maintain the health of the forest. That without the regular forest fires, the forest, the plant life, and then consequently the animal life became much less healthy. And so there's an element to fire and even to destruction that is beneficial if used appropriately or understood appropriately. So in part of our contemplation about this act, we're asked to look at what needs to be destroyed in our lives, what is unhealthy, no longer needed, going to generate dis-ease or discomfort in us, and how can we allow the fire to sweep that away and cleanse. That process, beneficial as it might be, is still ultimately scary. Death and destruction are not easy. And if we return to the ocean wave metaphor that we've been using, we can see that perhaps a little more clearly. So in creation and maintenance or stasis, we see the wave being birthed from the depths of the ocean, pushed by some mysterious impulse up, emerging from the surface of the ocean, and then coming into full form. And if we imagine that we're a wave rising up from the ocean and in full form, from that vantage point, from the tip of the wave, when we look around, we see separation and distinction. We see other waves, but we're less able to see the ocean out of which the waves are emerging and then into which they dissolve. And so as we see all of these independent, seemingly separate entities, we're recognizing the dissolving process, how these waves disappear and are seemingly destroyed. And we experience the loss of that, those separate entities that we see around us. And that is very scary because there's, from that vantage point, no longer a connection with the ocean. There's just this seemingly separate entity around us that dissolves and disappears, destroyed. Even though we see that process around us and inside us, we don't often acknowledge that it's happening. So when we look at the world around us from our separate wave vantage point, we see constantly that things are dissolving. But then also within us, we experience constant dissolution as thoughts and emotions rise up inside us and then disappear. And each time we exhale, we're letting the breath leave and facing the unknown that arises following the complete exhalation, and that little pause where it's uncertain whether there will be a next inhalation. We don't really contemplate that, but that is our experience of breathing if we were to become more connected to it as a process. So we have this experience of it constantly, and yet it's still really scary because of this sense of separation and the sense of individuality that we spoke more about last week. Our spiritual practices, all of our spiritual practices from any tradition, and then specifically from this tradition, are asking us to sit with that uncertainty. And in this worldview. We use our practices to become more and more and more aware of our ocean nature. That is at the essence. If, or when, perhaps, would be a better preposition. So when we become more and more aware of who we are, what we are essentially made of, then returning to that feels less foreign and perhaps slightly less scary. So that's if we look at the wave ocean metaphor from the perspective of the ocean is generating these individual waves and then reabsorbing them back into itself. And that is in this paradigm being used as the metaphor for what happens to us. Out of the mysterious, we are formed by some impulse that we don't understand fully yet. And then at the end, we are reabsorbed back into that. It's like the exhalation carried out of the body back into the air, and then the air generates the next inhalation. The ocean, to return to that metaphor, the ocean, as each wave dissolves, nothing is augmented to the ocean. The ocean doesn't suddenly get bigger because the wave has moved back into it. And when each wave is created, as we spoke about earlier, the wave doesn't detract from the ocean. So like us, we are created from the infinite, and then into that infinite space we return. We're reabsorbed. Considering that perhaps part of why that reabsorption or dissolution process is ultimately so scary is also because we don't have language to articulate that process. Where we have language to articulate the process that forms something. So we recognize in the process of creation that there's a gestation period, and that's needed to bring something fully into form, to birth something. There has to be a period where it's held and molded, and that's the wave beginning beneath the surface of the water and then coming into form. So there's recognition in our language of that process. And yet there's not a counter word to articulate the process of reabsorption as we slowly release back into that from which we arose. And perhaps just recognizing we don't have language for that process, but it is a process, might be helpful. The non-dual tantric tradition takes this process even one step further. So ultimately, when we talk about this act of the dance, we're talking about death and the layers of destruction and dissolution and reabsorption or retraction that happen at that time. And then also, as I already referenced, through our daily lives on smaller levels. There's an additional layer, though, that I want to recognize now. And that is when we come into form, as we talked a bit about last week, we develop a sense of who we are based on all of these things that are ultimately not permanent. They are not things that are unchanging. So most of what we use as ways to define our separateness are things that shift and change, or at least that can shift and change, even if we hold on to them. The tendency is to hold on to these things that define us, and as a consequence, build up the sense of identity. Those are things like, I'm a daughter, I'm a teacher, I'm Mona, not Joan, or whatever. That these are things that separate me from all that is around me. So this tradition says that we can practice dying, in fact, that we can die before we leave this body, and that process of dying is the process of releasing our connection to these things that are ultimately not permanent and not part of our oceanness. So our oceanness is that which is the same across individuals, and that everything that's layered on that sameness is what creates separateness and identity and uniqueness, and that we can hold those things. Those aren't going to change necessarily, but we don't have to define who we are as a consequence of them. If we can, through our practices, become more and more and more aware of who we are ultimately, and as a consequence, who everything in the world around us is ultimately, we tune into the oceanness and operate from that place, from recognizing, even as we stand up and have that individual wave vantage point, that we are made up of the fabric that makes up all of these other waves that we see around us emerging and dissolving. And that is the process of dissolving that can happen right now at any moment, and that we can practice toward, and that we can, as a consequence of releasing those attachments to identities that are not permanent and that take us away from our sense of who we ultimately are. If we can release those connections, then we can feel or taste the freedom that comes from being fully connected to our ocean essence. And perhaps that's part of what's driving Shiva in his ecstasy, in the wildness of his dance, is that he understands the thread that is the same through birth, life, and death, through that he holds a connection to that which is permanent and unchanging, and that is unborn and undying. And as a consequence, he can dance with great ecstasy. Any thoughts or comments, shares or reflections? Hi, Janice.
I have a question, Mona.
Okay, Virginie.
In the often fire is considered to be purifying, and in the Nataraja, I was wondering if it means that when he's holding the flame, does that mean that at death we are purified of the subtle impressions that we make during our lifetime, removing the samskaras that are created during our separateness as a wave?
So the question is, fire can be purifying, and is it in the way that at death the impressions that we have created through this lifetime are released or destroyed or dissolved, right? That's the question? I'm repeating it because on the recording, sometimes people can't hear the questions from the Zoom platform. So just to make sure that they're available. So that's a really great point. And I think that's even more specific to what I was saying about the forest fire, cleansing and ultimately purifying the forest from potential dis-ease and things that are ultimately harmful and no longer needed. So I do think that this stage of the dance is, and that the fire here is purifying. I think it's purifying also, not just then, but now, that through this process of dissolving our connection to that which is not permanent and not ultimately who we are, that we are pure in the sense of more fully ourselves. So pure in the sense of undiluted by unnecessary aspects or components. And so I don't think it's just at death that those that we experience that purification, but that there's a purification element to the process of recognizing and releasing our connection to the components that aren't essentially who we are. And that's the practice. That fire is lit through the intensity of our practices and the longing to know our ocean nature. What do you think?
So if I understand correctly, in the non-dual tantric view, then there is not much discussion of the topic of reincarnation, because you give away or give a wave to return to the ocean, free of any individuation.
I'm sorry. The dog barking is making it difficult for me to hear all of your question. Can you repeat or statement that, please? Nala, come.
Yes, I was just saying that then the tantric view does not really address the issue of reincarnation, because you go back to being part of the ocean, and your individual, whatever made you an individual, is burnt away or dissolved or reabsorbed, and you do not keep any of the individuality that made you you.
My understanding around that, and is there ideas of reincarnation, and do we retain any of our individual characteristics when we dissolve back into the ocean? So there's some theory around that, but we just don't know that for sure. And so the tradition doesn't spend a lot of time, my understanding is that the tradition doesn't spend a lot of time speculating. Thank you. Other thoughts or comments? Questions?
So the dance, part 1, part 2, part 3, is it a progression, or is it a like waves that can come and go, and you go that not the individual, but like the concept of destruction, whereas previously it was maintaining. So it's, are there lots of mini dances, or is one long cycle, I guess I would say?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a question for sure. So Tina's asking if there's just one long dance that we're describing, or if there's multiple mini dances. And for sure, there are multiple mini dances happening all the time, have been happening, continue to happen. And that's very clear in the teachings that, it's happening like on a world level, on a slower level, on a faster level, happening in each moment, right? Like with each breath, there's creation, maintenance, dissolution. With each thought that arises, there's creation, maintenance, dissolution. Like it's happening on the very smallest plane and then on the very largest plane. And possibly, and certainly my understanding is that the tradition says that it is also happening at the grandest level possible. So we are also in the middle of one, or somewhere, in the middle of one long dance, while having many, many dances happening as well. Other comments, thoughts, or questions, or anything more, Tina, to say to that?
Well, so last week we talked about like I think it's like devotion and trying to progress in a way in our towards what is deeply true.
Mm-hmm.
And so is Shiva's dance to propel us into a upward spiral, or into a I guess I'm questioning like a judgment, or saying I'm practicing to attain something but not striving.
Yes.
With the flow, we use from all different aspects, and so I guess when we talk about dissolution as purification, like it makes me think that that's like a judgment on what has been happening before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And yet, like the dance starts from, or I don't know if it starts from there, but it includes like part 1, part 2. So I'm just wondering.
Yeah, no, those are really, really good points. So the kind of questioning and the grappling is around the ideas of acting and striving and going with the flow, and is this moving us in an upward direction? Is it actually moving us any or not at all? Or kind of, if I were to summarize it a little bit, I might even say like, well, what's the point? I hear a little bit of that in your question, Tina. Is that accurate or no?
Well, no, I don't. Well, I don't think it's what's the point, as in it's futile, but more like trying to discern if yeah, purification, that
right
aspect.
Yeah. And how do we work with that idea of purification if it's not about striving, and that there can be a sense of judgment in that language? And so those are good points, and I'm going to see if I can address them, and then you kind of jump in and let me know if I'm kind of moving off, because there's many different layers there in those questionings and in that exploration. So in many ways, I think about the process of the practice as an undoing as opposed to a doing. And we're undoing all of the interferences to the understanding of who we are at our essence. And that undoing involves releasing things that we carry that are no longer necessary. One of the ways that we can feel that or experience that is just in the way that we hold tension in the body that's not useful. So, a classic example would be the tension that we hold in the jaw doesn't actually, most of the time, do anything useful for us, except take up energy that we could be putting somewhere else. So the tension in the jaw, we could see as something that takes me away from my understanding of my oceanness, the essence of who I am. And that if I can release, dissolve that tension, then I am more able to feel into my essence. And each time I dissolve away a layer of unnecessary tension, I am becoming more myself. So pure in that I have released tensions that are not inherent to my being. Whenever I release those tensions, I free up energy that can be directed in other ways and ultimately can move me toward an understanding of my ocean nature. And the more and more and more in touch with that I get, and the more and more and more I'm able to release that which is not necessary or serving or is something that ultimately was never meant to be permanent, but perhaps I've used a lot of effort to make permanent. So tension in my jaw, if it came one day when I was like studying hard for a test when I was a teenager, and then I've continued to hold that, I've made it much more permanent than it was ever intended to be. And so as I release the things that were never meant to be permanent, or my attachment to those things that were never meant to be permanent. I become more purely myself, unburdened by the things that I've collected. And so this process of dissolving is actually kind of more of a process of, we might say, relaxing or releasing that which is no longer serving us. And at times it might feel a little intense, and ultimately it leads us toward freedom. And so it's that upward spiral. And to keep us going on that way, we do need to, know really clearly that we're wanting to understand who we are at our essence. And we want to, even if it's scary, release anything which is not part of our true, not part of who we are at our deepest level. How is that sounding? Yeah. Yeah, I think, sorry.
Add something?
Yes, please.
Mona?
Please, Kathy, yes.
Yes. It actually just sort of, I realized that the modern term we use these days is getting out of our own way, in a sense. But it just brought to mind something I read the other day that I didn't quite understand. And now suddenly, in listening to you talk about this, I understand it more. So I might like to read it. And it's a book called The Way of the Rose. So it's written by an American couple who have been visited by Mother Mary in recent years, and they've written this book. And so this is a quote by the apparition of Mother Mary that said to them, evolution is a kind of dance that we do with one another. Most people think of dancing as moving through space with another person, whereas dancing is really the vacating of space into which another person then moves. The continuous vacating and refilling of the same space, that is dance. That is the reason why dance can express things that cannot be expressed in any other way. So it's that movement, it's it's that dissolution. It's stepping back so that something else can come manifest or come forward.
Yes, that's a really beautiful layer on exactly this metaphor and this image, this teaching. Very cool. Yeah, and I really like that idea. Vacating is a really interesting word, right? Like because I think about, the way that we can take over spaces and push our energies into the spaces, and then how we can retract it. And retraction was one of the words that we used as the definition of samhara, this stage of the dance. And so we retract our energy out of that space and give more room for someone else to step in. And so that's a really lovely addition to the whole set of images and the conversation. Thank you. other comments, or shall we move to a practice that goes with this? So make your way into a comfortable seat that allows the torso to be more or less upright. You don't have to have a super formal seat, especially tonight. And then close your eyes. And with your eyes closed, relax the body without slumping, so that there's inherent length in the torso. Round that length through the center of the torso. Deliberately relax. So let the weight of your body settle more deeply down into the seat on which you are sitting. Peel away layers of tension in the belly. Release as best you can tension across the tops of the shoulders and in the neck. Release the hinge of the jaw and let all the muscles of the face grow slack. And that might part the lips slightly. Soften the eyes so that tension there releases. And as well, soften the edges of the nostrils. Become aware of the breath. And tonight, we're just very simply going to follow each exhalation, completely allowing it to fully dissolve. And you don't have to lengthen the exhalation or manipulate the breath in any way. So as you bring your attention to the breath and continue to hold your attention there, specifically, become aware of where the exhalation begins inside you. And simply follow the breath as the exhale dissolves. Let the breath in arrive, and you can follow that as well if you want, but in particular, bring a little bit more concentration and awareness to the exhale. And it doesn't matter where the exhale goes. Just simply follow it. And it may not actually move out of the body in the way that you think it will. So as much as possible, relax ideas of how the exhalation moves. And simply let yourself follow each exhalation from beginning to end. Continue to dissolve tension, softening the belly more and more and more, the shoulders, the jaw and the eyes. And perhaps you'll notice that when caught up with thinking, there's a subtle layer of tension that arises in the body as well. And practice dissolving all the layers of tension in the body, in the mind, and simply watching that exhalation be reabsorbed into the air around you. See if there's a sense that you can let the edges of you, the outline of your form, become a little more porous, and that there's less distinction between you and the seat on which you are sitting, between you and the earth underneath you, and between you and the air around you. Continue to watch the exhale. Dissolve completely. Feel into the experience of your body. Notice the quality of the breath. Notice the pace of thoughts. And then without adding tension, gently deepen the breath. And with your next exhalation, join your hands together at your heart. And we'll close the practice with one Om. Inhale.